My podcast is mission driven. There's billions of people who are behaving non-sustainably, and I would like to help them not just behave sustainably, but enjoy it.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good morning, Joshua Spodek. Previously, episode 1128 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just 2 years, 11 months, 27 days, 14 hours, and now just about 30 minutes, plus or minus a few minutes, since we last had that conversation. That was then. This is now. Joshua, how are you doing today?
I'm very good. And in that time, I'm sorry that I missed you when you were in New York City. It just didn't, the schedules didn't work.
Yeah, which is understandable, right? The technology gives us a grand opportunity to schedule and be here in the click of a button. New York train stations, however, that's another thing, right? All by its own self.
Next time.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a next time. But how have things evolved? The last time we had an amazing conversation. Thankfully, Daniel Bauer connected us. You were doing a ton in the leadership space and the way you were teaching in this unique format. So please tell us, how have things evolved?
Yeah, I'm still teaching leadership and at NYU, and I do lots of corporate speaking and things like that. I'm focusing increasingly on environmental leadership, where it's similar leadership skills, but it's applied in areas where people feel different emotions, things like shame and guilt or helplessness and futility. And I don't have to tell anyone the importance. It's front page news almost weekly now.
So is that from the perspective of the corporate person, or is it from the person who is working in the corporate industries? Because, for example, I worked in a cement manufacturing company before, and the quarrying, when I see it, I'm a part of this, right? We're destroying the earth, but at the same time, we're creating cement, and that helps build structures. So is it targeted for me, that person, or the person who owns the company?
I have two main strategies. One is for the public. And if you look at the guests on my podcast, I'm getting increasingly well-known, world-renowned people who are heads of industry, champions in sport, cultural leaders. And with them, I walk them through a process where they share an environmental value of theirs and then act on it. And then we part and we come back again for a second episode and they share what it was like. And it's almost always something that they like. They almost always report back, I wish I'd done this earlier. I wish it was easier than I thought. I didn't realize how effective I could be. And I want, with the public-facing podcast, I want to help people see that they're not alone. There are other people who are acting on their environment, that they should have an expectation that when they do it, they'll like it. Because right now, most people think that they will not like it. They'll think that it's deprivation and sacrifice. Separately from the public-facing work that I do, there's working with corporations. And so I want to work with the most influential people in organizations, generally the CEO, the C-suite, and the executive decision makers. I walk them through the same process, but instead of playing it for the public to hear, except at their option if they want to, I walk them through this experience and more privately and help them take that experience that they had personally and apply that to the company, so that the company, years ago, it was clear that most companies had to act more sustainably. And for a while, they could get away with just kind of saying we're more green or doing some superficial things. But that time has passed. They get called greenwashing if they're not authentic and genuine about it. And what I bring in that most people don't think about, and ultimately in the long run is critically important, is for the leaders, the decision makers, to behave consistently with the values that they profess. The world is too transparent not to do that. What they don't get is that if they do it, they will like it. They'll be glad that they did. Sure, they'll save some money on costs and things, but they'll also vastly improve morale. They'll attract talent. And most companies, the more junior you get, the more the people want to do something sustainable, make their company more sustainable. It's the decision makers at the top, they're generally older, and they're not looking at 50, 60, 70 years of their lives with the predictions that we see. So I help them change their beliefs, the stories they tell themselves, their expectations, and then I help them propagate that to the rest of the company.
That's amazing. I'm fascinated by the fact of what happens on a podcast, specifically for the person that's producing the podcast. there seems to be a ton of structure in the process that then transfers into other aspects, other principles that you uncover, and then they're applicable to life. This morning, I had someone on the podcast. He's an MVP, and one of the things he said is on the last conversation, even before that, right, was 1913. Do today what others won't, so you can do tomorrow what others can't. And it seems as though there's a mixture again in what you're saying, where 80% of what's necessary requires action. Would you say that's correct?
Oh, for sure. In my case, my podcast is mission driven. There's billions of people who are behaving non-sustainably, and I would like to help them not just behave sustainably, but enjoy it. And I've learned that this analogy I use a lot. If you go to the gym enough, eventually you'll see a guy who comes in who's never been to the gym before, has never lifted weights, but has read a lot of books and watched a lot of videos. And I can say this about lifting weights, but I could say it about I told it to a friend, and he said, "Oh my God, that happens with my wife, and she's an opera singer. It happens everywhere." And so the new person comes in and starts telling someone who's been going for years, "Oh, if you grip it this way, you'll get a little more advantage, or if you stand that way." And the person who's been going for years is looking at the person who's only read books and has never actually lifted and is thinking, "You're so ignorant, you don't even know that you're ignorant." And in the area of the environment, virtually no one has tried to live sustainably, say to try to keep their emissions below the IPCC the Paris Agreement recommendations. And if you haven't experienced it, you don't know what you're talking about. So in the environment, it feels like we have a world full of people who are all saying, "I read this thing and you should do this." And the other person saying, "Well, I read this and you should do that." At least in the gym, there are people who go all the time and have some experience. But right now in the world, most people don't have the experience of having meaningfully tried to live sustainably, not just going without straws for a week. And when they do, they realize that lifting weights, there's a challenge of your muscles. You have to lift the weight. But there's also, how do you prioritize the rest of your life? How do you explain to people that you can't do something because you're going to do this? How do you change your diet? It propagates everywhere, and it's more emotional and social skills than simply just exerting your muscular strength. Likewise, with the environment, it's not just avoiding meat, but it's how do you explain to people what you're doing? How do you prioritize new things that you didn't before? How do you keep doing it? How do you find joy in it? And that's what I'm trying to help people do. It's not simply build this technology and everything's solved. We have to change our beliefs. If we believe that population growth will just work itself out, it's not going to work itself out. There are countries that have solved this problem. And I'm not talking about China with the one-child policy, but other places that have worked on population have done and been very successful, bringing prosperity. Anyway, it's very different than what people expect. It's
I would guess
not simply a matter of technology and legislation.
So. Again, the principle of if I only had this, then I can do that. The counterbalance, right? But what's interesting, so the stream of thoughts that you carry, I'm intrigued because, of course, we spoke about the reflective and introspective, and of course, the social and the emotional. Are there many people that carry this same stream of thoughts that you carry? Is it similar to what's happening with the environment, where many people are not venturing to have this experience of sustainability even with themselves?
Outside the environment, no one outside the environment tries to lead by saying, here's how to get someone to do something. Make them fill them up with guilt and shame, tell them a bunch of facts, and they'll figure out what to do. Outside the environment, everyone knows you lead. It's about the other person. What are their goals? What are their motivations? What are their emotions? And how can you connect those with the task at hand? So outside the environment, if you talk to any sports coach, any business coach, any great leader, if you look at the great speeches of Henry V at Agincourt by Shakespeare, or Patton's speech to the Third Army, or Mandela's speech, I'd be willing to die for. These speeches embody exactly this. Or I Have a Dream. It's a couple days after Martin Luther King's birthday. These are outside in the environment. People get this is how you lead people. What's the vision of the future? How do we get there? Who are our role models? In the environment, people still feel a lot of guilt and shame. And most of the dialogue, most of what you hear people say is driven by their own guilt and shame oftentimes, or their own, it's more venting. You don't hear a lot of what I would call leadership. Spreading facts and figures and doom and gloom and telling people what to do is at best management. Leadership outside the environment, it's everywhere. Inside the environment, it's very rare.
That's wonderful. Well, I'll tell you something, Joshua. It is such of a grand opportunity to chip in here to say, hey, I'm going to give Joshua a call, see where he's at, see how things have evolved, and to know that you've not given up, my friend. Of course, it's evolved tremendously, but the core principles are there. I believe it's both motivational and inspirational, what you're doing. More so, I thank you for your service to humanity.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
Well, just from what you were saying, I'm glad to hear that others find it inspirational. I would be lying if I didn't say many times I've wanted to give up and just say, look, this is too hard. It's not going to work. But, athletes who, when you're exhausted because you've given your best, that's ideally you win. Maybe you don't win them all, but how you feel is what you've put in relative to what you can put in. And I just keep coming back to when I feel like giving up, how much better I'll feel if I give my best.
Well, I appreciate you, my friend. Again, such of a grand opportunity, a great pleasure, one which I treasure. Joshua, keep doing what you're doing, my friend.
Me too, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. Amazing audience. Again, Joshua Spodek. You just type that guy's name in, it pops up. Everything he does, just type Joshua Spodek. Yeah, Joshua, a pleasure. I treasure. Thank you for being on What is Inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.